I'd like to start by talking about the upcoming sequel that you have to Lift Off.
You might not recognize him, but you've probably read some of his writing. This is Eric Berger. He is a senior space editor for Ars Technica. He also wrote the popular book Lift Off, The Desperate Early Days of SpaceX, where he interviewed Elon Musk extensively, as well as other original team members of SpaceX. In this interview, I'll be talking to him about his upcoming sequel. I'll grill him on many questions that he did not get to prepare for in advance. And he is just a great source of space news, so I hope that you enjoy this.
I've talked about Liftoff, I don't know how many times. It's a great book. And the SpaceX story continues.
When I got done with Liftoff, it was a great stopping point. But it was really just the beginning of the story. And it was pretty clear that the Falcon 9 was really the next story to tell, because it both picks up right where the Falcon 1 leaves off, but also really is just the foundation for everything SpaceX is doing today. Everything that's gone into Starship has been a learning from the Falcon 9, from the high cadence to obviously landing and booster reuse, but even things like really learning hard lessons about launch pads that they, that we're seeing like 3-day turnarounds on the launch pads in Florida. And those were just they had to learn so much to make that happen and make so many changes. So it just really felt important to tell that story. And you had the first human missions as well. And so it just felt natural to sort of tell that story as a precursor to the Starship age.
Yeah. And so it's May 1st. Are you done with it yet?
Yeah, actually, I just did the final edits about 2 weeks ago. Could only make very, very small changes at this point because it comes out in September. So the book's in, got all the permissions for the photos, all the editing's pretty much done. So yeah, it's written.
So just for some like background information, why do we have to wait until September to read it?
The book publishing process is very arcane. I wrote the bulk of the book in the first half of 2023, and then made substantial revisions during the last half of the year. But it's going to go to press here probably in about a month, and it just takes a long time to print books, I guess, and get them on the schedule. I mean, but basically the timeline I've always had is like once you turn in a quote sort of quasi final draft, it takes about a year to get to publication.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, and the story continues. Like, you're probably going to release a book about Starship, right?
Well, we'll see. This one's really hard because there's just so much happening and so many characters. You don't want to overburden people with facts and technical details and people. So I really tried to stick to a narrative. But I mean, you've got the early Falcon 9 flights, you've got Cargo Dragon, you've got Crew Dragon, you've got Falcon Heavy, you've got all the launch sites, you've got landings and reflights, and there was a lot. People ask about Starship, but we're really in the early days of that story.
Correct.
SpaceX has done some amazing things, but they've got a long way to go to get to a reusable orbital vehicle. I think really the big question for me about Starship is what kind of future it really does unlock, because the world really isn't ready for a rocket that can lift 100 tons or 200 tons to low Earth orbit and be fully reusable. And you can have these, there's no mass constraints, basically no volume constraints. No one has ever really built that kind of a future before. So while a lot of the really fun stories are happening now, any meaningful book I think would have to be 5 or probably more like at least 10 years in the future.
That makes sense. Now, I know with Liftoff, you had to spend time with each of the early employees, Elon, especially for re-entry. Did you also have to have a lot of sort of new interviews with Elon?
There was a little bit with Elon, but it was more about the people who did it.
Right.
And the fact is, I've had a lot of time with Elon when this was happening in real time, because the story basically spans from November 2008. The penultimate chapter ends basically with the landing of the first Crew Dragon mission with Bob and Doug. And then there's a final chapter of that. So it's basically like 10 to 12 years of story there. And like I had been covering SpaceX full time during a lot of that. So there's some real time reporting. So really it was finding the people who did the things and then going and asking them about what they did. So like, who was the flight director, when Amos 6 exploded on the pad, right? So I talked to him and got his whole story and what it was like to be there and see that big fireball and the mess after that. What was it like to be the guy in Florida who had to go to ULA and ask to see where they thought the sniper might have been after that rocket exploded? What was it like to truck that first Falcon 9 rocket from Texas to Florida when you couldn't go on the freeways, and so you had to take a 10-day trip through the Louisiana byways and run into buildings and things like that? So it was finding the people who had the stories about what it was really like.
Liftoff seems like it's a massive success. Was there anything that you did differently writing Reentry, or any lessons that you took from the first book into writing the second one?
It's a great question. Like, Liftoff was my first book, and I think about, like, I would not have been able to write Reentry right out of the box, because Liftoff was fairly straightforward from a narrative standpoint. You had the 4 launches to build around of Falcon 1. And so from that sense, it was fairly straightforward story. In Reentry, it's complex. There's a lot more people. There's a lot more things going on. So it was really about trying to put the readers inside the moments that mattered most.
Right.
So Liftoff was written kind of like a real life thriller, sort of, what I was going for, like putting the reader alongside the engineers and technicians. And so I tried to very much stick to that style with Reentry, but it's longer. It's about 50% longer.
Wow.
And a lot more people in it. So
yeah, how do you condense that many years?
Yeah.
That's crazy that was your first book and it's so successful.
No, I got lucky with the story, right? I really felt fortunate that no one had really dug into those early years before and opened up about it. So one of the ways I saw that with Reentry was really like the first third of the book focuses on development of Falcon 9 and the first 2 or 3 launches when everything was brand new, from test firing the rocket to recovering Dragon for the first time to the upper stage not relighting like it was supposed to. Just when they were sort of working all the kinks out of the vehicles. There's a very famous story about the second launch of the Falcon 9 where there's a crack in the upper stage engine. Right, and they have to go in, and a technician has to come in and cut all the way around it. Like, that guy's name was Marty Anderson. So I went and had a couple long interviews with him, and he told me that whole story and how he had a great fear of flying, so he didn't really want to fly from California to Florida before that launch. But it was going to save the company weeks and weeks when they really didn't have weeks and weeks to spare. It's just everything was so new in those days.
He's working for SpaceX and he's afraid of flying. That surprises me for some reason.
Well, the funny thing is he was an airplane mechanic before he got to SpaceX. So
should we be afraid of flying?
Well, we've seen what's been happening with Boeing lately. I think maybe we got to be a little fearful. I don't know.
Right. Well, and I'm going to get to that. I have a couple bullet points that I want to cover. Some of these things, may or may not go out of order. But, I follow your posts, I follow your articles, you're a great source of news. One of the things that's really concerning me, seems to be concerning you, is Artemis 3. And, in your opinion, should we change Artemis 3 to a non-lunar landing?
Well, I think it's ultimately going to happen because NASA is going to want to maintain a cadence of missions. I think, first of all, they're going to want to figure out really what they're going to do with Artemis 2. The fact of the matter is the heat shield issue, 18 months after that flight, is still not resolved. That's a little bit concerning to me. And so I think while they'll probably still do a lunar mission with Artemis 2, they'll fly around the moon and come back, I'm not sure that's 100% set in stone. And then NASA is looking at all these different options for Artemis 3, right? Because you've got these lingering questions about Orion. You've got obviously major questions about whether Starship is going to be ready to land on the moon and most importantly, take back off from the moon to get back up to lunar orbit to rendezvous with Orion. You've got serious questions, I think, about the lunar spacesuits that Axiom is developing. And so NASA is publicly talking about September 2026 for Artemis 3 as lunar landing. I think that's completely unrealistic. NASA does as well, and so that's why they're studying these options. I know very well that one of the things they've done is ask SpaceX to look at a low Earth orbit Starship mission where they would rendezvous with Orion low Earth orbit. And the benefit of this is you could test out a Starship docking to Orion and then performing and then test out the habitability of Starship before you tried to do this in lunar orbit, going down to a landing. Essentially, if you think about it, Artemis 3 condenses Apollo 9, 10, and 11 into a single mission in 2026. And so that's a huge leap that NASA is trying to take. And so I think ultimately, for reasons of wanting to maintain a cadence, let's say that Artemis 2 happens by the end of 2025, you could do sort of a lunar rendezvous or an Earth orbit rendezvous between Starship and Orion in late 2026, early 2027, and then maybe do the lunar landing in 2028-ish timeframe. And so you wouldn't have such a long break between missions. Ultimately, I think that's probably where NASA will settle, but they're not there yet. You asked me what I think they should do. I mean, I think you really have to let Starship play out, right? You have to see how far they get this year. I mean, we've got Flight 4 coming up probably in May. If there's no major anomalies on that flight, I think they get into a much higher cadence of missions this year. And once Starship gets flying regularly, then you can start to really test out of all these things. And one thing, I learned from the Falcon 9 is how much iteration they did on the fly. And every launch, almost in those early days, they were trying something new, either an upgraded version of the rocket or changing the way they were steering through the upper atmosphere. And it took them 20 flights before they landed successfully on the first stage. And so once they get flying at a much higher cadence, they're going to learn all of these things. I think it's just going to accelerate. But there's so much learning to do to get to a lunar landing that they just have a long way to go. So, I don't think NASA's going to make that final decision anytime soon, but they're certainly looking at all their options.
You wrote some article recently. SpaceX has now landed more boosters than most other rockets ever launch. Let's not forget all that SpaceX has achieved thus far. Do you think people are being too impatient with how hard these things are? Just Starship in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe. I remember, in Mexico in 2016 when Elon first talked about Starship. That's now 8 years ago almost. So it's like it has taken a long time, but these things, as you say, Ellie, these things do take time, right? These are very hard projects. There's a reason NASA has never done propellant transfer in space, right? They haven't done it. Like, it's really hard. SpaceX, and you raised a great point with the Falcon 9. One example is this idea of supersonic retro propulsion. So when the Falcon 9 comes back through the atmosphere, its Merlin engines ignite as the vehicle is going several times faster than the speed of sound. Now, that sounds insane because you've got your rocket flying backward through the atmosphere, the engines are in the atmosphere, and they're igniting in this supersonic regime. It's a rocket engine ignition. I mean, it's crazy. But when they first started working on that a decade ago, NASA was interested in that because they knew that to land larger vehicles on Mars, they were going to need to do supersonic retro propulsion. And so they were right there alongside SpaceX studying it. And NASA had done the theoretical studies, but it was SpaceX who put this into practice with the Falcon 9 rocket. So I don't think we should lose sight of what the Falcon 9 is. That's why I wrote a book about it, because I think it's a really miraculous rocket. And as I say, the foundation of all their success today. They've taken so many learnings from that and put it into Starship.
How do you source your news?
Well, that's a secret. No, I mean, it's a mixture of like people I've known for a long time in the industry who I trust, who when they tell me something, I know I can take it to the bank, to people who approach me. So it turns out when you write, interesting, sometimes authoritative, sometimes speculative, but informed stories about the space industry, that draws out other people. So a lot of the sources I get are people coming to me and say, hey, have you heard about this? Or what do you think about that? And then I'll go look into it. And, sometimes it's not a good tip, but a lot of times it really is. So a lot of it is just people kind of being familiar with my work and coming to me and saying, hey, you should take a look at this.
And do you also like keep up to date on, subcommittee hearings, or is it more just straight from people that talk to you?
It's all of the above. You were talking about the Artemis 3 story. I was watching the House budget hearing yesterday and was shocked to see the first question from the Oklahoma representative was about that change in profile. So there's people in Washington reading what I'm writing, I guess.
So, oh wow, okay, so that's why you were surprised, because they probably saw your article.
They had to. I mean, it's the only one who'd written about it. So
it's interesting comparing NASA to SpaceX. They're so different, like their philosophy and how they move and what we kind of know even about what's going on. SpaceX, you can see things from the side of the road down at Starbase.
Yeah. I'll tell you, one of the miracles I think of SpaceX is NASA's this huge bureaucracy, right? It's been around for almost 7 decades. And this is what happens, right? Government agencies become larger. They sort of protect their own interests and seek to, protect themselves. That happens with corporations too, right? There was a time when Boeing was the young upstart disruptive company in aviation. SpaceX and Blue Origin were basically founded at the same time, Blue Origin about 18 months earlier. SpaceX, after 22 years, is still extremely disruptive. And that is not typically how it works, with startups. Like they go through their disruptive phase, then they mature and they lose what's called a founder's mentality. I think the really powerful thing about SpaceX is that they still have maintained that core disruptive approach. And that was one of the validating things for me about writing Liftoff is you could see all the principles that Elon was instilling in the first employees in the first years of SpaceX, like lived on 2 decades later. And, you can say what you want about Elon's behavior online, how he's run Tesla, how he's run Twitter or X. And certainly in reentry, I catalog a number of mistakes that he made at SpaceX alongside the triumphs. But the fact that SpaceX still has that mentality of going out and just being so disruptive, as you say, moving as fast as you can, having hardware on the side of the road in Boca Chica and test flight, that's totally a testament to Elon and his energy.
Yeah, and they're the movers and shakers, and they're doing the things that have never been done before. So it's very inspiring. Who do you want to interview next, and or maybe not just interview, but like write another book?
One of the mistakes I made at Liftoff is I started working on a new book too quickly, so I'm going to take a break. I am very interested in the Mars helicopter because I think that was such a phenomenal, successful mission. So I'm going to probably take a look at that. The person I'd most like to interview, honestly, is Jeff Bezos.
I knew it. I was like, he's going to say Jeff Bezos. I don't know why I thought that, but
I mean, me and about 9 other reporters had an opportunity 8 years ago now to go up to the factory in Washington, D.C., and he spent 3 hours walking us around. It was fantastic. Clearly a very smart guy, knew a lot about rockets, had a lot of passion about the subject, but he has not engaged in a meaningful way really with the space community since then. Done very few interviews and even fewer with people who actually know the right questions to ask about space, can push a little bit. And then that's a real disappointment to me because he's put so much money. He's probably put $10 or $15 billion at least of his personal fortune into developing, reusable space flight. He's in it for the right reasons. But it's he doesn't want to talk about it. And there's a million things I'd love to ask him because I know that the public things Blue Origin are doing is great. They're doing some great things behind the scenes. They hired great people. So it'd be great to really get an update from him on where he sees the future of spaceflight.
Do you think that he's just because I saw that Lex Friedman interviewed him recently? Do you think he's afraid of being pushed, or I mean, I wonder.
I think he's just in a stratosphere so far above us where it doesn't really matter. He doesn't need to appease stockholders for Blue Origin. He doesn't need to do media, so he probably doesn't want to do it. When he had his space flight in West Texas, maybe 2 years ago now. I don't remember the exact date. It was the summer, I guess, of 2021. So 2.5 years. We all went out there, and he was going to have this press conference right after his flight. And so we all kind of got ushered into this building. It was all very nice at the facility in West Texas. And he gets up there and he sort of does a little talk, and some other people do the talk. He hands out some awards, and he takes 3 questions, right? And not really from the real space reporters. So it's like he just doesn't want to do it. And it's as a reporter who, as I say, would love to ask him questions. I mean, he's put more money into this than anyone, far more than Elon has into private spaceflight. Although Elon has really put more time and sweat equity than Jeff has.
He's put more money than Elon?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Elon did not put that much money into SpaceX.
Wow. Didn't know that.
Elon put about $100 million in at the beginning and some more kind of along the way to keep it going through 2008, 2009. But since then, SpaceX has largely existed upon NASA contracts, commercial contracts, and they've just been super successful when they need private equity. They just go out and sell private shares. I mean, it's a company whose success has really allowed it to survive. Whereas Blue Origin has generated virtually no revenue since its existence. I mean, they've had some contracts, but nothing on the order of SpaceX.
Right. Speaking of, Blue Origin, they should start their suborbital hops again pretty soon, right?
Yeah, they named Ed White as one of the people on their next flight, which presumably will carry 6 people. They haven't set a date yet. I would imagine it'll be sometime this summer, hopefully, because it's been quite a while since they had their anomaly and they had their first successful flight back on an uncrewed flight. So I think soon.
So, this is recent news. We see that SpaceX updated their website. You can now inquire to join a mission, get a seat. Much more expensive than Blue Origin. Is that just crazy to have covered SpaceX from so early on and see that now, you can, if you're super mega rich, maybe get on a flight?
It has come a long way, because really was being able to have private space flight, and it is a reality today between the Axiom missions, Inspiration 4, the suborbital space missions, and now what SpaceX is doing with this program. I think it will be more interesting to me to see how many takers they get, if any, because I'm not sure how robust that market is. It hasn't really been tested, but we haven't seen any other private Dragon missions other than Axiom or Jared Isaacson's missions. And so I don't know whether that's they haven't had the capacity or whether there just isn't the demand. I think it may be the latter, but we should find out in the next year or two.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find a price point for it. People are speculating maybe like 55 million. Do you know anything more about what that seat could actually cost?
It is funny, because one of SpaceX's main things was price transparency, right? With the Falcon 1, with the Falcon 9, at a time when there was no transparency. But now in the human game, they don't do that. 55 million per seat sounds about right to me, but I don't know the exact price.
And that's far more than Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, right?
Well, yeah, but those flights are about
joy rides,
180 seconds of weightlessness, and
right.
You go up and come down. And this is you get the full rocket launch, you get days of weightlessness now, and then you come back, and it's an orbital mission versus a suborbital mission. There's really not a whole lot of comparison, and that's not to denigrate the suborbital mission. I think if I were to go to space, I probably would want to go on a Blue Origin spacecraft, because that's a pretty attractive flight profile to me. So yeah.
I was gonna say, if you had to pick between the three, I mean, I guess they're not apples to apples, but
I mean, if I had to pick, I would take Starship to the moon. I think that would
yeah.
be, I'd want to go to the moon.
You posted a number ahead of the Starliner flight, less than a week away, by the way, citing that according to NASA's analysis, the probability of loss of crew on the first Starliner mission is 1 in 295, above the NASA requirement of 1 in 270. I've posted about this. A lot of people, the comments aren't good. You know, they're worried. They're worried about the crew. They're worried about the safety. How confident are you in Starliner?
I'm confident that NASA did the analysis that it thinks it needed to do to make sure that spacecraft is safe. And I think that the really sobering results of the first flight test in 2019, when they had some very serious software problems, really forced NASA to finally take a hard look at Boeing in the Starliner program. So I'm pretty confident. But human spaceflight is hard. And, you know, the Boeing team, quite frankly, is not the SpaceX team. They don't have that operational experience in terms of human spaceflight. And you know, it's probably going to be fine. I think the 1 in 270 target, NASA said, is more of a mathematical exercise. I don't think that that's really the true number. You know, the number for the space shuttle was like 1 in thousands risk of loss of crew, and there were 2 in 135. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I mean, I'll be watching closely and really hoping for the best next week.
Yeah, it's just strange. It's like, you know, Boeing has been in the news so much for aviation, and it's weird to see all these comments that are like, you know, so fear-based. You know, it's like I wonder if the crew.
Well, let me say this. I have full confidence in NASA. I mean, the people that are involved on that side of the program, commercial crew program, take it very seriously.
Right.
And so if they say it's safe to fly, then I believe them.
Right. Bob and Michelle Murray want to know, who do you think is the most likely candidate to buy ULA? And do you think it's likely to happen before the second certification flight?
I think Blue Origin, as I reported, is far and away the most likely candidate to buy ULA. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. As for timing, I thought it was going to happen in the first half of this year, and it's now May, so I don't have great intel. I think that certification mission probably is pushed out to at least September, so probably will happen before then, but I can't say that for sure.
How is it already May?
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
Ross Bishop wants to know, please ask for Eric's opinions on the future of Mars exploration and whether he thinks SpaceX could really be the first to send humans to the red planet, maybe even without NASA.
Mars exploration is very much on SpaceX's long-term pathway, but in the near term, their two priorities are getting Starlink V2 satellites up with Starship and delivering on the human landing system for NASA in the Artemis program. So humans to Mars, as I say, it's definitely on the roadmap. I do not think in my lifetime or yours, humans will go to Mars on anything but a Starship or Starship-derived vehicle. The architecture just don't make sense. Cost prohibitive. You know, it's probably like 8 to 12 SLS launches to launch a small human mission to Mars and back with sort of conventional architecture, and they can launch once a year. So do the math on that. That's very unlikely to happen. There's just no real imperative to do that. So NASA can talk about moon to Mars all it likes, but really it's the moon program, Artemis, now and for the, you know, at least the near-term future and probably for the long-term future. So if SpaceX does sort of prove out that it can build a fully reusable Starship and reach a high launch cadence, then that does open up the possibility. My sense is that it would be the initial missions would be jointly done between NASA and SpaceX. It just makes a lot of sense for regulatory reasons, things like planetary protection and things like that. You know, we'll see. I think that future is very much unwritten. I will say that if they work together well on the Artemis program, as I think they will, then that would open the doors to sort of a mission. I mean, if you look at Starship, the lunar lander, NASA's getting a hell of a deal on that. They spent $2.9 billion for development and the first lunar landing. That is the amount. That is less than they have spent for a decade every year on development of the Space Launch System rocket. That's the annual development budget for a rocket that reused boosters from the Space Shuttle program, reused main engines from the Space Shuttle program, and the external tank is the same diameter as the SLS core stage. There's so much commonality in those vehicles. So NASA's getting a huge bargain on the lunar lander. If it done it traditionally, it would have been a 10, more like probably a 20 or $30 billion contract.
Wow.
So I think that if NASA and SpaceX partnered on a Mars mission, there's lots of valuable things that NASA could bring to that mission in addition to funding. And by providing the transportation system to SpaceX, to NASA, SpaceX would provide the one thing that NASA really can't do. I think it's a match that makes sense for a lot of different reasons. I think that's ultimately what will happen.
And I know, people are always asking Elon, what year will we have humans on Mars? So I'm going to ask you, what year do you think a human will land on Mars? Maybe not stay, but land.
I'd be very happy if it happens in the 2030s.
It's so hard to know. It's so hard to know. In my last viewer question from Randy Custer, I would be interested in his perspective on some of these struggling companies like Astra and Virgin Galactic, for that matter, Blues, New Shepard, and space tourism in general. So maybe just, there's a lot of startups, a lot of them don't succeed.
Launch business is really hard. And it's even harder if you have to compete against SpaceX, which all these companies ultimately have to do. Astra has had its time in the sun. I don't think we'll be hearing much from them. Virgin Galactic is about to do its last Spaceship 2 flight. And I think it's probably a 50-50 proposition on whether they ever fly again. They've got a long road to go to get to their Delta vehicles. If they do make it, then I have some hope that they could be efficient. Blue Origin suborbital space tourism, I think, is a very niche product and kind of a stepping stone to their orbital business, which is going to be the main focus of their efforts. We're getting to the point, Ellie, where launch is becoming a solved problem. And especially once you have Falcon 9, New Glenn, Starship, Relativity comes back out with a reusable vehicle, Stoke Space has a reusable vehicle, Rocket Lab has a reusable Neutron, then launch is going to become a lot less sexy. Look at it now with Falcon 9 launches. Hardly anybody pays attention to them because there's 2 or 3 a week.
Right.
And it's like, wow, they launched again. And launch is going to become a commodity that we take for granted. So I think really the more exciting thing to think about is, okay, if launch is increasingly a solved problem, then what do you do with that capability? That's why I'm spending a lot of my time looking at the in-space transportation companies trying to develop business plans around the moon, where NASA's funding and going, I think, because that's really the next step, the thing to look at over the next 10 or 15 years.
I hope that you enjoyed this interview. If you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Ellie in Space if you're not already subscribed, and thank you so much for watching this video.
If you guys enjoyed this video and all of my Starship coverage, please subscribe to Ellie in Space. It's completely free, and that way you won't miss any future videos. If you want to take it a step further, please consider signing up for my Patreon. YouTube revenue can be very unpredictable and hit or miss, and you guys on my Patreon are why I'm able to take these trips and help me experience the life that I'm very thankful to live down here at Starbase and many of the other places that I've gone to report for the channel and the places that I'll be going in the future.